This is Henry Bonso and Times Radio. Let's talk about a guy who he sees himself as a global citizen, Sir Tony Blair. And he's called for taxes on sugar and salt as he joined Jamie Oliver to demand anti-obesity measures modelled on the fight against smoking. As well as criticising the Conservative focus on individual responsibility, Tony Blair's think tank is challenging Labour to embrace an extension of free school meals as well as taxes and bans on unhealthy food. And earlier this evening, I spoke to Amanda Ursel, a nutritionist, and Harrison Griffiths, a communications officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I started by asking Amanda what she made of this approach.
Well, I'm surprised to find myself feeling that in some ways we've sort of backed ourselves into a corner. And whilst initially, say 10 years ago, I would have said to you, I don't think this is a good idea, I've been in this world of nutrition for more years than I care to mention. And I have come to the conclusion that what we're doing at the moment and what we have been doing over the last 20, 30 years isn't working in terms of people's long-term health. And so I'm slightly surprised to find myself thinking, well, this is probably worth a go, because we know that the food industry is full of some really innovative people, great food scientists, great development chefs. And if they are put in a situation where they need to make changes, I believe they probably can. And I think it would help people to eat in a more healthy way if the foods that they tend to buy on a regular basis that are currently particularly high in sugar and fat and salt and things like this are actually reduced. And I think that's a way to, it's worth exploring that way forward.
Well, the question is whether it should happen by government diktat. Harrison Griffiths Young from Young Voices UK. Tony Blair says it's inexcusable to continue to persist with strategies that simply are not working. Amanda agrees with him. What about you?
I also agree with Tony Blair. We shouldn't continue to pursue strategies that aren't working. We should repeal the sugar tax that already exists. And with it, the vast majority of other nanny state policies that continue to hammer home the cost of living crisis on the poorest precisely when we don't need it, and continue to cost the taxpayers billions of pounds and reduce their choices and control over their own bodies.
Why would you repeal the sugar tax when it's there precisely to discourage people from going for the unhealthiest food, the kind of food that leads to obesity and reduction in quality of life and a massive burden on the health service, increases obesity? Why would you repeal that?
For a wide variety of reasons. Number one, it's not actually particularly effective in reducing obesity. It is indeed true that since the sugar tax came in, as you'd expect, the amount of sugar in sugary drinks has declined quite significantly, but that only accounted previously for about 3% of the calories that people in the UK ingested. Sugar tax in Mexico, which was brought in 2014, has reduced the number of calories on average taken in by 16. That's 16 calories, not 16%, a drop in the ocean by any measure. A review of most of the evidence on this found that it was uncertain as to whether the sugar tax had any effect on preventing obesity or other adverse health outcomes. But that's just one thing. I mean, the other two more important issues from my side is, one, you can't just consider this in the context of what health effects sort of fluctuate, go up and down. You also have to consider the economic trade-offs. Sin taxes are, and nobody disagrees with this, extraordinarily regressive. The poorest income quintile spends usually between about 20 and 25% of their income on indirect taxes, like sin taxes, including on sugar, alcohol, smoking. The richest spend just over 10%.
But Harrison, let me just intervene for a second. The richest people in this country, the best off, live up to 14 years longer than the poorest, and a huge amount of that is due to diet. So why would you continue with what we're doing?
Well, it's not actually necessarily to do with diet. So one, it clearly factors in naturally, but one study that looked into whether sin taxes were in fact economically regressive, and it was a Lancet study, so you can imagine the types of people who would be looking into this were quite keen to prove that it wasn't regressive. They tend to be pro-sin taxes. They tried to justify sin taxes not being regressive by pointing out, indeed, that richer people do spend more of their money and more of their time doing unhealthy things like eating sugary foods, smoking and drinking alcohol. So it's not necessarily all to do with diet. There's a lot more at play there.
All right. Well, let me bring Amanda back in. I mean, Harrison's hit back hard, saying he agrees with Tony Blair. There are lots of these things that are not working. The sugar tax is regressive. The sin taxes are regressive. It punishes people who have least capacity to financially afford it. So why would we do this?
I think you make some very good points, but I think the sugar tax is so limited, and we're talking about sugary drinks, and I feel like what we're doing now isn't working. And is it because, as I say, I've been in this business, as it were, for a very long time. I graduated in the 80s. I've seen so much happen in the world of nutrition that hasn't worked, and I just feel that I do really believe that the food industry can be a great place for innovation, and I feel that if the food industry is persuaded, and that may be through taxes, to really make an effort across the board, so not just with drinks, but across the board, to reformulate, then surely that's worth a go. And I take your point about the tax on sugary drinks. It's a drop in the ocean, but I don't think it's. I think we need to look at things from a wider perspective. I think we're talking, salt, for example. If we can get salt levels down, which we did very well at in around 2014, and there was a really progressive campaign to reduce salt, which happened over time, and it did actually influence the food industry to reduce the amount of salt in food really significantly, and it kind of went out of the window and levels shot back up again. And I think that proves that it actually. The food industry can respond. They can reformulate.
But wouldn't they try and find substitutes which could end up being harmful, such as aspartame, which the World Health, I'm not sure if it's saying it right, aspartame or so, aspartame, which the World Health Organization said last week might be carcinogenic. Today they kind of rode back. But I, for one, who like Diet Coke and chewing gums that contain aspartame instead of sugar, it's made me think.
Well, I think it is really important to have a much more holistic long-term view on this. I think we do short-term things that aren't necessarily going to work in the long term. And I think from my point of view, I've just got to that point in my life where I'm thinking, look, we haven't done very well so far. And I don't think for a moment that salt taxes, sugar taxes, fat taxes are going to solve the problem of overconsumption in this country or any other country that has a modern food industry. But I do think we need to start thinking laterally. We do need to start trying really hard to put the great talent in the food industry into a direction that will help people make healthier choices, because poor health outcomes do come from the way we have been eating over the last 20, 30 years. So I don't think it's good enough to just keep on doing what we're doing, because if we do that, we'll always get what we've got, which is the nation getting, less and less healthy.
Yeah, I mean, Harrison, if you don't want the government to use whatever instruments are at its disposal to try and change our behaviour, to nudge us out of poor choices, what's the alternative? Just to keep on encouraging us to, exercise personal responsibility. That's not going very well. More than 2/3 of adults aged between 18 and 64 are overweight or clinically obese.
Indeed. Well, just from a starting point, my day job, I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I am, by moral conviction, opposed to the government using very many of the levers at its disposal. I think people own their own bodies. It's their choice, and government has no right to use coercion to stop them doing so.
But even if, as a result of their behaviour, it's costing the National Health Service billions.
You see, well, this is one of the massive issues I have among many with the National Health Service, because we talk about issues like sin tax, we talk about issues like vices, smoking, drinking, eating too much, being a cost on all of us, as if they're a genuine, what economists call a negative externality, a bit like pollution, for example. But bad lifestyle choices are not, in any meaningful sense, an externality. They have been artificially externalised on society through the government's monopoly healthcare system, which doesn't actually make individuals responsible for paying the costs of their bad lifestyle choices. I agree that we shouldn't be responsible for other people's lifestyle choices, but that's a flaw in the NHS system, not a justification for restricting people's freedom of choice. And in fact, even if you just discard everything I've just said, if you disagree with me on the moral issue, it is simply the case that sin taxes on sugar do not have any meaningful effect in the short term or the long term on average levels of obesity, but they do cost people money. And we're in a cost of living crisis right now. Piling more burdensome taxes on struggling individuals is, in my view, pretty unconscionable.
All right, Harrison Griffiths and Amanda Ursell, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us on Times Radio. Thank you.